When it comes to scary photos, there are a ton of them available. With as many photographs that have been taken over the years, it's no wonder that some strange things end up in the photos which the photographer didn't notice as they were taking the photo. There could be some rational explanation for many of these photos, however, sometimes scary things pop up in videos that defy any explanation. With that in mind, check out these 5 things hidden in pictures with scary and mysterious backstories. Before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button to get notified every day for more amazing content. With that being said, let's begin. Number 5. Boot Hill Cemetery Ghost Photo. There's almost nothing better than a good old western story, especially when they involve some legendary gunfighters from the past and also the well-known places in which they inhabited. Many of you might be familiar with one of those places, namely Tombstone, Arizona. In Tombstone lies the famous Boot Hill Cemetery. One of the interesting things about this cemetery is that it used to be called Tombstone after the town that it was in. The other thing that you might not have known is that it isn't the only cemetery that was called Boot Hill. The first one was actually in Dodge City, Kansas. Many cemeteries were named this based on some old term that meant those who lied there died with their boots on. It meant that most of the people who were buried there met violent ends, such as in gunfights or other things which weren't natural. However, there was also a high rate of what's called pauper burials, and poor strangers or people who lived in the town were buried with their most valuable possessions, which back then would be the boots on their feet. The Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona was founded way back in 1878. There are about 300 people who were buried here, and only about 2/3 were even recorded in the graveyard's ledger. It was closed in 1884 because a new cemetery was opened. Of course, the graves became neglected, and some of the markers ended up missing, which added to the anonymity of the many graves. Even though it was closed down, some outlaws were still buried there, and then the final person that was buried there was Emmett Nanoli, who was the caretaker. Some say the ghosts haunt this cemetery, and in 1996, it would seem that a ghost decided to show themselves. A man by the name of Ike Clanton and a friend of his visited the graveyard. One of Ike's ancestors, by the name of Billy Clanton, was buried here, along with Frank and Tom McLaury, who were in the famous OK Corral gunfight. Ike ended up taking a photo of his friend dressed up as a gunfighter and wearing what was worn back in the 1880s. Ike's friend wanted the photo on black and white film, of course, to give it an older look and feel. Once back home, Ike took the film to have it developed, and then picked up the photos and sent them to his friend. It was when Clanton's friend had a chance to look at the photographs that he got a spooky surprise. In one of the photographs behind him was a mysterious figure dressed and wearing a black cowboy hat. However, there was no one else but Clanton and his friend in the graveyard when the photos were taken. Did Clanton capture a ghost from the old cemetery? The photo is still an unexplained mystery. Number 4. The Backseat Ghost. When it comes to modern spooky photos that some say are unexplained, there's no telling what kinds of things have been done to them with the artful use of some photo editing tools. But when it comes to older photos using older equipment, it's a little more difficult to doctor them or mess with actual photos printed on photo stock. Such is the photo that a Mrs. Mabel Chinnery took in 1959 of her husband, who was sitting in the passenger seat and waiting alone in their car. Mrs. Chinnery was visiting her mother's grave that day, and for the most likely and obvious reason for this being his mother-in-law, Mr. Chinnery decided to wait for his wife in the car. However, the story gets really scary from here on out. Mrs. Chinnery took her camera to the cemetery to snap some photos of her mother's gravesite. She then decided to turn around and get a photo of her husband in the car. She saw nothing strange that day, and they later took the film to be developed. It was then that the Chinnerys got a shock. In the photo of Mr. Chinnery sitting in the car, there's someone sitting behind him. But it wasn't just anyone. Mrs. Chinnery had immediately recognized that the person was her mother. But of course, since her mother was buried in the graveyard, this was impossible. However, the car was parked very close to the mother's gravesite. The photos were taken to a photography expert who analyzed the images and the film. The expert determined that there wasn't any double exposure or any weird reflections that were causing this to happen. So was this the ghost of Mrs. Chinnery's mother in the backseat of the car that was captured on film? Perhaps she was angry that Mr. Chinnery didn't visit her gravesite, and so she instead visited him. This photo has been determined to be authentic. So what do you think? Is it real or a fake? We'll let you decide. Number 3. The Worstead Church Ghost. This is another case of an older photograph which was taken in August 1975 and is said to be one of the most convincing images of a supernatural phenomenon ever captured. A woman by the name of Mrs. Berthello was with her family, and they were visiting the St. Mary Church in Worsted, North Norfolk in the United Kingdom. It was a summer day, and so the family decided to take refuge from the sun inside the church. Mrs. Diane Berthello had taken a seat on one of the pews toward the front of the church, while her husband took some photographs of the church and then some photographs of his wife. When they had returned home and had the film developed, they noticed something scary and mysterious in one of the photos of Diane. Sitting behind her was a ghostly image of a woman who was dressed in white, wearing an old-style bonnet on her head. However, when Diane's husband took the photo, he distinctly remembered there was no one else sitting near his wife at the time. The family kept the photo and then returned to the church a year later and showed the photo to the vicar of the church. At once, as if he recognized what he had seen, he then told the story of the White Lady, who at the time was a caring and healing soul. However, the legend of the White Lady has a different story attached to it, and it was said that she would appear in the church on Christmas Eve, and that anyone who saw her would suffer an untimely demise. And so, in the 1830s, there was a man who heard the legend while in a pub where he was staying. He, of course, thought this was some hoax, and so went to the church to prove it. He stated, perhaps to the people in the tavern after having a few drinks, that he would go to the church, and if he saw her, would kiss her. As it was Christmas Eve, he decided to put the legend to the test. Somehow, he got inside the church and had climbed the belfry. In the meantime, his friends started to worry about what happened to him as the hours passed and decided that they better go search for him. They found him huddled up in the belfry, shaking in terror and talking to himself. His last words were, "I've seen her, I've seen her," and then he was gone. However, Diane doesn't believe this was the White Lady that was in her photograph because she had been suffering from an illness, and after she visited the church, her illness had shown improvement. Perhaps this is the White Lady of Worsted Church. Number 2. Shadows of Hiroshima. It was on August 6, 1945 when a US B-29 Flying Fortress bomber unleashed a uranium missile that exploded an estimated 1,800 feet above the ground. The attack, which many have called utterly horrifying and devastating, wiped out 70,000 people instantly. If you've ever witnessed the blast of an atomic or nuclear bomb, or perhaps seen the famous movie Terminator Judgment Day, then you can kinda get the idea of the terrible force these weapons possess. The ferocity of the blast left behind eerie shadows imprinted on concrete steps, the pavement, and concrete walls which had survived the blast. These haunting impressions were all that was left from the intense heat of the explosion, which changed the colors of the surfaces, leaving behind outlines of people and objects. In one photograph, there's the shadow of a person who was holding a ladder which was left on a wooden structure. In the next photograph, you can see what looks like the shape of a person holding a cane or a walking stick which remained on the steps until 1967 when it was cut out and put inside of a museum. In this image, there's the shadow of a man which appears to be wearing a hat and was likely running for cover. Objects that survived the blast, such as this valve, were left imprinted on the wall behind it from the atomic blast. Buildings that survived the blast were left decorated by what looks like flames and the erratic heat from the impact of the explosion. On the road, many shadows of objects were left imprinted on the pavement, such as this bicycle, and even bridges had imprints from the posts that were etched onto the tarmac. The scary thing about these images is that some of them ended up lasting for decades, until some of them were eventually eroded by wind and rain. Imagine if you had walked up to one of these shadows and seen it for yourself. That would be creepy for sure. Number 1. Time Traveler. One of the more mysterious things that's been caught on film is the story of the woman who's seen walking with what appears to be a cell phone. That doesn't sound too mysterious until you realize you're looking at a piece of film from a 1928 Charlie Chaplin film. It wasn't until the 1980s that the first commercial cell phones hit the market, and even those phones were a lot bigger than what's seen in the film. Some people who have seen the film say that the woman is obviously a time traveler who was using a modern-day device. Interestingly enough, the film was shown to a group of 100 people at a film festival, and in asking those people what they thought the woman was carrying and looks as though she's speaking into, no one could provide an explanation. Some say it's clear that she's talking, and she's on her own and not talking to anyone else, but instead she's talking into a device. Some have said this is some kind of hearing aid. If that's true, then why is she walking and looking down? And what is she trying to hear while walking? This explanation simply doesn't make sense. Could the woman in the old film have been some kind of time traveler? No one really knows the explanation for this short piece of film. It's too bad Charlie isn't around himself so we could ask him what he thinks.
Hope you enjoyed the video, Top 5ers. If you haven't already, check out our other channel, Americano, to enjoy even more amazing list videos. There'll be a link in the description, so check it out, as well as our other cool stuff.